Hello to all the folks watching at home and in the office. I am Elijah, and today we're going to talk a little bit about contemporary art and why it's so important to talk about contemporary art in conjunction with a little bit of culture. Behind me we have a very nice piece of art, very simple, black and white, lots of lines, lots of very interesting shapes that are made with the intertwining of the lines. And we're going to start to learn what this means culturally when we dive into the specific culture that we're talking about. But let's jump back and take an overview at what contemporary art is and what we might start to think about when we talk about the contemporary art movement. But when we think about this movement, we're thinking really 1980 to the present day 2020. So the contemporary art movement as we know it today has only lasted about 40 years. And we might think of artists like Banksy, artists like, say, Faith Ringgold, artists like, say, Jeff Koons. We think of a lot of these very, very, very prominent artists who have a lot of passion for what they do, artists who put a lot of emphasis into the statements that they're trying to make. And let's harken back from these very large political, social, economic, and just overall highfalutin statements and take a step back and talk about some different types of culture and how we can diffuse culture with Aboriginal and contemporary art. And I might have just spoiled you a little bit there. We're talking about Aboriginal art, so let's take a trip to Australia and talk about some of our artists in Australia. We're talking about artists like Timothy Nelson. We're talking about Emily Ama-Indroy. We're talking about artists who have changed the contemporary art scene, and they could only do this through the very, very, very long process of creating an Aboriginal culture that has been in a long process for the past 30,000 years, and we're having a diffusion and a change from the usage of wood, the usage of tapa cloth, which is like a paper-like substance, and the usage of natural pigments from the earth and from the sea, and we're moving away from that usage of more natural resources and natural artistic mediums, and we're moving towards more synthetic mediums like acrylic, and we're using actual canvases now. And we wouldn't be able to be at this point in Aboriginal art history if we did not have some European intervention. And those pesky Europeans always love to put themselves maybe not necessarily where they're always needed, but in this case it did seem to benefit, as seen here and as seen, or as you're going to hear a little bit later. So in the 1950s or thereabouts, we have these influx of European missionaries from, we're talking the United Kingdom, we're talking France, and we're talking places like Spain and Portugal. So we're having this influx of European missionaries starting to sort of change or sort of rework the northern and western territories of Australia to try to make them more like they are in Europe, which is a trend that we see throughout history. It doesn't always work too fabulously, but Europeans still try to do the best that they can and the best that they can see fit, and it's all they know, so we can't knock them for that. So what we're having when we see these missionaries come into Australia is a very, very, very large movement towards westernization on the part of the Aboriginals, because these Europeans really want Aboriginal people to be more like them. So they bring art, they bring culture, they bring different types of food. And one of the things that really, really, really stuck with these Aboriginal people was the art, the new mediums that had become available to them. We're talking acrylic, we're talking oil on canvas, we're talking lots of different mediums. Mostly the usage of canvases instead of using wood or using walls or using something like that. So it's much, much, much more refined and much more easy to transfer on, say, a print like this, or say to put it in a gallery. So it becomes a lot easier to make this cultural art into what we think of now as a real art that you can put in a museum. So what we're seeing when we see the Europeans go back to Europe in around the 1970s is the emergence of the Papunya Tulu movement, which is the cultural diffusion of Aboriginal art and culture into European style museum grade art. And it's this usage of dots, it's this usage of lines, it's the usage of shapes to tell stories, and that's what all the Aboriginal people have used prior to Europeans coming to the northern and western territories of Australia. So it's a wonderful diffusion of Western and non-Western into one. And we're having works like this that while they look pretty and they are visually appealing, we're having a lot deeper meaning when we start to learn about where these works come from and why it's important that we can have a print like this and why it's important that it has all these fluid lines, because this painting, Big Yam Dreaming by Emily Amayat-Njwari circa 1994, does tell a story. And it's a story that I might not be able to understand, or you people at home watching might not be able to understand, because we're obviously not from Emily Amayat-Njwari's tribe in the Northern Territory, so we can't really decipher what this means. While they could, we can understand that it does, in fact, tell a story, and all contemporary art should tell a story, and that is why we should have an importance of cultural diffusion between contemporary art and native cultures in, say, Aboriginal Australia.